Hi, everybody. My name's Martin. I'm the CEO at Codemagic. It's nice to see 37 people participating. I was thinking it's just going to be me and Marie, but I'm so happy to see everybody here. Today, I'm going to give a short introduction on how to set up your CI pipelines on Codemagic and cover some of the things that I've learned that may be unexpected from developers coming from Android going into iOS and maybe vice versa as well. I'll show you how Codemagic works and give you some tips on how you can speed up your CI pipelines as well. Today, I'll just cover the UI and the web app. If you're wanting to know more about how to configure your CI as code in the YAML file, there's going to be a separate webinar about that. In this one, I'll cover some of the basics and then give some tips as well that I've noticed people may benefit from. Right. If you have any questions, then you can ask them in the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on it, and then I think Marie can unmute you as well. Feel free to ask them throughout the presentation. I'll try and keep an eye on it, and Marie can message me on Slack as well. I'll try to leave enough time for questions because setting up your CI should be really, really simple. So I'll try to cover everything within 20 minutes and then leave time for questions if you have them. So I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, then. I think I can move this up. Yeah. So at Codemagic, you can you do CI/CD for Flutter. You can build, test, and distribute your applications. When you're signing up, we support GitHub, Bitbucket, and GitLab. And if you have repositories under that are from other sources, then you can connect those with SSH keys. If you want, you can also use our GitHub app as well. It's available from the GitHub marketplace, and you can install them per repository if you don't want to give access to your whole organization repositories. When you sign up, and the first thing we do is we retrieve your repositories, and they'll all be listed here. If you're connecting through Bitbucket or GitLab, we won't identify the language, so you won't see the Flutter icon next to them. What I'm going to work with today, what I'm going to show you, is our Not Last Meetup application. It's a simple counter app. And the first thing you do when you sign up is you can start your first build. I've done that already, and I'll show you what default workflow looks like if you're working on it. This is the web UI. So as soon as we identify your project, and you can see it from Codemagic, you can start configuring it. We will do a default config that allows you to automatically start building a debug version of your application. In the build triggers, you can select the branch watch patterns that you'd like to include and what you'd like to exclude as well. It's fairly straightforward. You can also trigger on pull request update or tag creation as well. Environment variables are something that you can use throughout your CI pipelines. For example, if you have private keys, if you have Firebase connected to your application, You may want to add a secure variable here, call it Firebase key, super secret key, and secure it. Once you secure it, then they will be encrypted in our database. And you can use them by specifying this environment variable anywhere within custom scripts. So for example, in here, I've set a custom script to that after I've cloned the repository, and I've echoed the script into our build directory. In this case, the Google Services JSON file. You can also have your dependencies cached as well. Dependency caching can help you speed up builds, but in general, when you're downloading the dependencies, then we have fairly fast internet connection. It's a gigabit internet. It's not going to give a very significant build increase, especially if you're building iOS applications in release mode. I'll touch on that a little bit later as well. In the tests, you can enable Flutter analyzer tests, Flutter tests, driver tests, and you specify the test targets over here. And you can choose if you want to run them on an iOS simulator, Android emulator, AWS device farm. If you're running them on iOS simulator, they're going to be fairly fast because the build environment is in Mac OS. If you're running them on Android emulator, it might be slower because if you're using Android emulators within a virtualized environment, Android emulators themselves are essentially VMs. So you have what's called a nested virtualization. So if you're running UI tests with Android emulators, I expect them to be slow. You can also use AWS device farm if you want to run the tests on real devices. And the config for that you can find in our documentation. We use an open source project called Sylph that you can use to specify your AWS device farm integration. In the build section, you can define a lot of things. You can build for Android, iOS, web, Mac, Linux, and we don't support Windows right now. We plan on adding Windows in 2020. You can select your Flutter channel that you're using. You can fix it, or you can choose either stable, beta, dev, or master. And same goes for Xcode versions as well. Currently, we've deprecated Xcode 9, and it starts from Xcode 10. And CocoaPods, you can fix the version, or you can choose default, which will default you to the latest stable version. You can specify the mode that you want to build with, and build arguments. Build arguments is where, for example, if you have flavors of your applications, then you can specify those flavors here, or if you have schemas, as in iOS, then you can specify the schemas here as well, and then it will build. And in the publishing section, this is where most people run into some problems. And most notably, the problems are going to come from iOS code signing. In Codemagic, you can code sign your applications in two ways. You can have automatic code signing, or you can have manual code signing. With automatic code signing, what we're doing is we're basically using an RSA key that we use in Xcode to generate provisioning profiles and developer certificates from Apple Developer Portal. What this means for you is that once you connect your developer portal to Codemagic, you don't have to worry about code signing anymore. We will do that automatically for you. We will generate a developer certificate or a provisioning profile within your development team in Apple Developer Portal and sign all your applications with your team's certificates. That means that you don't have to write any Fastlane scripts or any code signing scripts to manage your certificates. And the manual version is that it's a little bit more tricky. You would need to go to Apple Developer Portal and generate code signing certificates yourself. And once you download them on your, or once you get them on your keychain on a Mac computer, then you need to export them as P12 format files. And then you'd have to upload them to Codemagic. The same goes for provisioning profiles as well. This way, some people prefer to use this method if for some reason they can't or they're not allowed to share their Apple Developer Portal credentials with any third-party provider. So that's why we have this method here as well. And finally, if you'd like to distribute those applications to the App Store, then you'd have to find, you'd have to register the app first. So we can't make the first release for you. You'd have to create the app from the App Store and then get the Apple ID, app-specific password, and the app ID. And all these steps, the details are listed, are quite detailed in our documentation as well. So with the manual code signing, we have the step-by-step guides on how you can get those P12 formats. And with automatic code signing, it's going to be a lot easier. But if you have Fastlane, for example, in your release pipeline, then you can use Fastlane scripts as well. So in our case, we've already done that. And if I run a new build, it's going to build an iOS app. And what we do when we build the application is our build machines are Mac Minis and Mac Pros. In my case, I'm using a Mac Pro right now. And those Macs are running on ESXi operating system, which is acting as the virtualization layer. And every time we start a new build, we create the virtual machine from scratch. That means that it's a clean machine. And once the build finishes, we destroy the environment. We don't store any of the source code on our network or anywhere. So after we prepared the machine, we're going to fetch the resources, clone the repository, install the dependencies, and start testing. If the tests are passing, we'll start building and publish the app as well. If I'm giving some tips, or I promise to talk to you a little bit about if you're an Android developer going into cross-platform development like Flutter, then oftentimes what we hear is that your iOS build times are quite slow. And people are wondering why that is or what they can do to speed things up. And I had a presentation that I wanted to share with you to explain why the iOS build times can be slow and what actually happens when Flutter builds your iOS applications. And I'm just going to skip through a couple of slides, but the problem that I wanted to illustrate was that the iOS build time can be up to 42 minutes in some cases if you're building with Mac Minis. And this is not ideal. They say the build should be about 10 minutes long. And the 42 minutes was caused by a fairly simple application, which was this app called Neverlate, which is similar to a counter app, a little bit more to it. It was a random excuse generator that showed you why you might be late for work or for a meeting. It's just a gimmick we did in our team. And what we did was we added Firestore dependency to it. And Firestore was actually one of the reasons why the app was building for 42 minutes. And the impact that Firestore actually had on the application was if I'm building iOS debug without Firestore, it's going to build within 50 seconds. But with Firestore, it's going to build 1,200 seconds, which is like 20 minutes. And if I'm building for release, you'll see that build time goes up by 3 times. And between debug and release for Firestore, it goes up twice. Android, it's not really affected. So then if you're coming from Android, you might think to yourself, why can't we just cache everything? That should speed things up, right? That's not really the case. The reason why iOS is a little bit special is because when Flutter creates your binaries, the IPA files, what it actually does is when you have your project, the Flutter build commands will prepare your Xcode workspace. So these are fairly basic commands, but Flutter build commands, when they prepare the Xcode when they prepare the iOS code base, they also generate the .app file, which is a file that you can use to run your iOS app in the iOS simulator. And the trouble here is that this is not an app that you can run on your mobile phone. So this is not an IPA binary that you need in the end. And in order to produce the app, you need to compile it from source code. And from these steps, you can use cache. So this is where you can use Xcode's derived data, for example. But as soon as you start to create the binary, the IPA file, you need to run Xcode build archive. And as soon as you run this command, all existing cache is lost and everything is compiled again from source. And this is something Apple introduced with Xcode 10. And then it creates the question that why isn't Android affected? Doesn't Android do something similar? And the answer is that Android, when it creates the APK or Android app bundles, then although Gradle is not perfect, the build speeds are quite good with Gradle, because instead, when we're compiling the IPA file, we have to compile everything from source twice, whereas with Android, we can use pre-compiled dependencies like jars or AARs, for example. And this is the main reason why Android builds a lot faster than iOS. And if you're adding more and more dependencies to your applications, the build times can skyrocket if those dependencies are just big, if they have a lot of source code. And then I guess I don't have the slides for this, but a couple of tricks you can do to speed up the iOS build times. If you are looking for speed up tips, if you're going low level and you think what you can do in your local environment, you can change the package manager from CocoaPods to Carthage, for example. And the advantage of Carthage is that with CocoaPods, you're generating, you're compiling the source code twice, basically. And CocoaPods have a lot of other problems as well. I'm not sure why it's the default go-to dependency manager for iOS. With Carthage, it comes with, it doesn't come with something like jars or AARs, but it comes with something similar to that. And this means that when you're archiving these, the Xcode workspace, then you don't have to compile from source, but you have somewhat pre-compiled dependencies that you're including in your application. So one way to speed up the iOS builds is if you're using Carthage instead of CocoaPods. Second tip that I can give is the way Xcode actually does the compiling. It used to be just one synchronous process, but with Xcode 10, it also introduced kind of asynchronous as well, and you can parallelize some of the compilation. So if you want to go even lower, then you can look at your iOS schemas and discover circular dependencies that have, so one target that has multiple dependencies that are building this target. So you can separate that into multiple targets that you can parallelize. And this is going to speed up the builds. Those are two things. But thirdly, and most importantly, from the CI side, you should invest into testing, because if you're looking at your CI pipeline, you can fail the pipeline if the tests are failing. And the more testing that you can do, instead of trying to figure out maybe what's the best way that I can reduce the iOS compile time, you may think to yourself, counterintuitively perhaps, how can I fail my builds faster? And you can fail them faster if you have more tests associated to them. And this is encouraging you to write tests, obviously. So the more tests you write, the faster your CI pipelines become. Those are the three things that you can do. In terms of CI setup, you'll notice that I have different workflows. Don't go crazy with workflows. Don't create 10 different workflows, because those are going to be really a pain to manage. A good way to think about workflows is you should have a very basic setup. You should have debug, you should have release, and maybe a third one as well. And some tips on how you can manage fewer workflows is that if you're building flavors, for example, if your app has flavors or different schemas, then you can add an environment variable here that can use scripts, basically. So you can think of this as like a dynamic flavor of your application. And with the dynamic flavor, you can set the build flag as dynamic flavor, for example. And during the CI build, you can fetch the correct flavor that you're going to use within your debug builds or within your release builds. So you still have the two pipelines, but the flavor that you're using is dynamic. So that's going to be fetched from somewhere else, if that makes sense. So instead of specifying a static flavor, you can specify a dynamic flavor that changes per the build trigger, for example. And one more thing is that you should always separate your Android and iOS builds. You don't want to build them within the same workflow. So you'd want to separate you want to build Android builds with one workflow, and you want to build iOS builds in another workflow. That means that we'd have to set up the environment, run the tests twice, but the majority of the time will be spent on the actual building of the application or the binary, and those should be done separately. One workflow is always going to generate one set of artifacts, and you can't build two binaries and distribute them to do different places. So you can't, within an iOS workflow, you can't build a release build and a debug build, for example. You can only build release or debug. You can't build both. That's another thing I thought about highlighting. But would you look at that? I managed to finish it faster. If you have some questions, I'd love to take them. And maybe answer some of your questions if you have some more specific ones. Yeah. Okay, maybe Marie can unmute Soham.
Hello.
Hi, Soham.
Hi. My question is there any place where you can see status of mail that mail is delivered or mail is sent or not? Because in last of 1-2 bills, mail were not sent when we didn't know that it's working or not.
Right. I don't think there is at the moment, but that's so the issue was that you thought that the emails were sent, but they weren't actually sent.
Yeah, the whole thing worked successfully, and it's showing that it's finished successfully, but we didn't receive the mail. So we ran that again, and then the mail came.
I'll
Means
write down.
if mail service is down or something like that, is there any place to check status of it?
So we use MailChimp to send out the emails. I'll write that question down, and then I think, I don't know if are you in our Slack channel as well? Yeah. Maybe you can ping me on there as well, and I'll make sure to get back to you. And then later, the questions that I don't answer here, maybe we can collect those questions and then post with the recording some of the questions and some of the answers as well. The question was about emails and if there's a way to check if the emails are sent or not. Okay. Then there was a question from Casey. Any plans to support signing both ad hoc and release from a single workflow? Casey, we can't do that. We don't plan to support it right now. What you can do as a workaround is if you have parallel builds. So for example, if you set the same build trigger for two workflows, one of which is, for example, ad hoc and one of which is release, then you will have the same trigger, but you will trigger two workflows at the same time. And those will build in parallel. One will generate release and one will generate an ad hoc binary. I hope that answers your question. And you can add parallel builds by buying them. We currently have one parallel build for the free plan. And Taha is asking, what are the challenges when bringing Windows support? Well, that's quite, that it depends on our priorities right now. The Windows support just means that we need to have Windows in, like, we need to have instances we need to have other than Mac hardware, basically. Right now we use Mac hardware. We're going to be releasing Linux instances soon as well, and we plan on changing our pricing a bit to make it more cheaper. So when we have Linux instances available, then you'll be able to not just build only on Mac OS, which has a higher price, but you can also build on Linux as well. And Linux is going to have cheaper price. And after we add Linux, later we're going to add Windows as well. So you can release Flutter desktop apps for Windows. And that's, you can expect Linux to become available in Q2 and perhaps Windows in Q3. Okay, Ricardo is asking, would it be possible to use Linux for Android and Mac for iOS in the future? Yes, Ricardo, that will be possible, yes. Is there any other questions? If we can have option to download APK IPF of Codemagic dashboard, it would be great. Okay. How many Mac Minis have you guys bought? Just curious. We have we have a lot. I think we service over 20,000 customers. Yeah, but we don't actually buy them. We rent them, and we rent them from a data center, and the data center looks after them and makes sure that they're always available and up to date. If we do have some, if you experience build queues, that's because we try to estimate the demand, because sometimes we reach peak times and then the builds may experience queues, and other times we don't have those peak times, so you don't experience queues. We try to, when we order new Macs, the provider takes like a day or two to add them into our pool. So if we experience a high peak, like, and the builds are always in queue, we'll just add more Macs there. And Soham is asking if we can have option to download APK IPF for Codemagic dashboard, that would be great. Soham, can you elaborate what you mean by dashboard? Because currently you can download them from the build, and you can export them as well. So you can get the URL of the artifact or the artifact link that you can use in your post publish scripts or your post build scripts as well.
For that, we need to make it public, or without making it public, it is possible?
I think it would be great if I can talk to you a bit afterwards, so I better understand the feature requests, and then I can answer it in the post webinar as well. Any plan to support Flutter web build deploy support? Currently, we do support Flutter web builds. You can build Flutter for web. In terms of deploy support, I don't quite understand where are you looking to deploy it. If you have if you run a post build script, for example, that deploys the artifact, you can deploy it anywhere you like. Currently, we have the out-of-the-box integration with AWS S3, so you can deploy them there. But if you're trying to deploy them somewhere else, then you'd have to write a script after you've built the web app. Any other questions? Yeah. So next time, Helena is going to talk about the common mistakes that people have when they set up their CI pipelines and they can't get their first build to work, or when they're setting up new projects. So if you are, thank you, Olo. If you are trying to, if you are having trouble and you can't get, or I hope you're not having any trouble, but if someone's planning on setting up CI soon for their new project, or if you just want to hear some common mistakes that people make, then Helena is going to cover them. And one thing that Marie told me to mention as well is there was a gift for you as well. And the gift is that, so right now we have included, we will include, I'm not sure if we added it this instant, free AWS device farm testing for all our users. So if you want to test your iOS apps and you want to run the UI tests on real devices, this is going to be free. I have to ask Marie again about how long it's going to be free. But I think it's going to be free for at least a month. And you can run the integration tests on real devices from Codemagic. So how we do that is we just link it up with our account. So when you're running them, then the minutes will be charged to us. And this is what we wanted to give to you guys. So thanks so much for supporting us. And I really enjoy working with the Flutter community. You guys are really cool. Okay, as we promised, short and sweet. Thanks for joining. Take care. Bye.